Nancy Lee Sanchez, and I am the Executive Director of the Kaplan Education Foundation. As you know, our mission is to bring educational opportunities to the most talented group of students across the United States. Our focus for the last 15 years has been to work with students of color that come from low-income backgrounds. It is part of our mission to reach a wider audience. And as such, we have launched the Privileging Higher Educational series. We, during this fall and winter, we will be bringing to you our first season, which will be covering the Black educational experience in the United States. We think that time is of the essence, and it is really important that we all get engaged in educating ourselves about the history of the United States, and specifically how educational resources have not really reached all of the communities, and especially that many people have been excluded from education on the basis of their race. This is why it's an honor for me to have with us today Eware Oseyande. He will be joining us during the next six sessions, along with our very own Rhoda Tamaklo, the Director of Operations, and a true partner of mine during the last 10 years. Thank you for joining us, and I hope that you will take the time to truly digest the information we are about to give you. We understand that sometimes it is very difficult for us to get engaged in these conversations, but we also understand that these conversations must happen, and that we also must address the social issues of today by first arming ourselves with facts, with historical references, and then to open up. Thank you.
Good day, everyone. I'm really happy to be here with Kaplan Education Foundation to talk with you about the subject of the Black education experience in the United States, testaments of courage, freedom, resilience, and dignity. The first lesson that we're going to deal with today is entitled The Lingua Franca of Freedom, the African Invention of African American English. The African American experience in education in the United States begins with comprehending the fundamental challenge that the first generation of Africans enslaved faced here in North America. The challenge of communication, the challenge of language. Education is indeed the transfer of knowledge. That transfer for humans occurs principally through language. To understand the experience of African Americans in education in the United States, one must first appreciate how African Americans came to create a language that enabled them to transfer their cultural knowledge and determination to survive and their will to be free from one generation to the next. What began as a seemingly insurmountable barrier, and I really want to emphasize this, Africans would create a language as complex and flavorful as the cuisine they cultivated from the scraps that fell from the master's table. A language as African as their souls, as African as their determination to be free. In doing so, Africans enslaved in North America forged a uniquely African language from the common vocabulary of their English enslavers, encased in their primary language structure based on their cosmology, culture, and conception of the world. A language that to this day has yet to be given its due. The mindset of white supremacy, such as it is, cannot make space for Black ingenuity. And so it will go out of its way to ignore, downplay, or otherwise dismiss the facts of Black achievement. In the case of the speech of African American peoples, our first language has been derided as broken English. What is misunderstood as Black English ain't English at all. Language is based on principles of speech and communication. It is more than mere words. Linguists have long recognized that there are 5 components of language that include syntax and phonology. Vocabulary is but a subset of one of the 5. The way African Americans speak has everything to do with the composition of the language systems of West Africa. Peoples whose conception of time, memory, and action, notions central to language, were quite different than anything found in Europe. The primary language of African Americans is an oral testament to the will, fortitude, dexterity, and magnitude of a people. Yet rather than be celebrated as a remarkable human achievement, it has been mocked and denigrated. The great novelist, Toni Morrison, winner of the Nobel Prize in Literature, has written, "It is terrible to think that a child with 5 different present tenses comes to school to be faced with books that are less than his own language, and then to be told things about this language, which is him, that are sometimes permanently damaging. He may never know the etymology of Africanisms in his language, not even that hip is a real word or that dozens meant something. This is a really cruel fallout of racism. I know the standard English. I want to use it to restore the other language, the Lingua Franca," end quote. That's the great Toni Morrison. In 1997, the Linguistic Society of America also affirmed the distinct language of African Americans. In response to the controversy then surrounding the Oakland school system's decision to acknowledge the language of African American children in their English instruction, the society released a statement that indicated that negative characterizations of African American language are incorrect and demeaning. They also took the opportunity to address the politicization of speech that leads privileged groups to claim the language of oppressed peoples as dialects, when they stated that, quote, "the distinction between languages and dialects is usually made more on social and political grounds than on purely linguistic ones. For example, different varieties of Chinese are popularly regarded as dialects, though their speakers cannot understand each other. But speakers of Swedish and Norwegian, which are regarded as separate languages, generally understand each other very well. What is important from a linguistic and educational point of view is not whether African American vernacular English is called a language or a dialect, but rather that its systematicity be recognized," end quote. The words in African American speech may be understood to be English, but everything else is practically derived from the language system of West Africa, what is the Niger Congo language family. There are over 1,000 languages within this family alone. On board the slave ships were Africans from across the Niger Congo region. They were the Fulani, the Iwe, the Hausa, the Mandingo, and many, many more. These were people with language and culture as complex, varied, and distinct as anything developed by the Europeans that enslaved them, the Dutch, the English, the Spanish, the Portuguese, and the French. Each of these groups had their own unique language, which was tied together by a set of similar principles of speech and communication. It is those principles that lay at the root of the language of African Americans and is responsible for the unique contours and corridors through which the English words fall from our tongues. Imagine being kidnapped from your home, your people, and all that is familiar to you, and being placed into a condition that is torturous in every way imaginable. Then I want you to imagine not being able to communicate with your torturers, having no comprehension of what they are even saying to you. Worse still, having no guarantee that you will even understand the other person's chained beside you, in the ship, in the holding cells, in the slave dungeons, on the auction block, or on the long walk to the plantation. There were no ESL classes on the plantation. Please understand this and allow that historic fact to settle on your consciousness. Whatever language skills Africans learned, that first and second generation, they picked up on their own in the most torturous conditions humans have known. These are not the conditions for learning, let alone survival. Yet, they pieced together a bond of common speech in the process of carefully crafting a sense of shared community as they tended to each other's wounds, physical, emotional, psychological, and spiritual. They infused this new language with a spirituality, which they then passed down to successive generations, enabling them to speak truth to power and chart a pathway to freedom. As Toni Morrison stated, it became their lingua franca. This African-American language became their means to simultaneously communicate with their enslavers and converse amongst each other across the language barriers of their ethnic origins, until those barriers disappeared in the bonds of communal will to be free. Within a generation, it would be transformed into their language of resistance and liberation, as the formerly educated among them would engage in what we now call code switching to, on the one hand, prove their equality with their oppressors, and on the other, to call out the contradictions of their proclaimed ideals of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, as the colonies became a nation while holding these very Africans in lifelong bondage. The reason for the derision of African-American English, in fact, the very reason for the derision of African-American people. Yet, just as Black folks have overcome every obstacle placed within their path by the enemies of freedom and justice, the recognition of this language and its African origin gives us the best clue and example possible of the indomitable spirit of a people who remain unconquerable. Toni Morrison once stated that we die. That may be the meaning of life, but we do language. That may be the measure of our lives. The invention of African-American language may be seen as the first mark and measure of the genius of African-American people. Thank you.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I hope that you enjoy that first lesson. It is our hope that you will join us in this second part, which will be a conversation with Rhoda and Eware. Again, thank you for being here, and I just want us to jump into this important conversation. So, Rhoda, Eware, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Excited to be here. So first, Eware, just to dive right into this, why is this topic especially important to educators to appreciate?
Well, easily, I would say that, as I tried to clarify in the presentation itself, that when talking about the language of African Americans, for example, the necessity of coming to a place of honor and respect for the language itself would only enable educators to better honor and respect the students they are, in fact, educating. There has been legacies of dismissal of what is a language unto itself that is, lacking a most appropriate term at this point in our development, yet nonetheless is indeed a language called only enable African-American vernacular English, African-American English, Black English, whatever you want to, Ebonics. The development of an understanding of the language itself as a language works to enable educators to step into the classroom with an appreciation for the legacy that the student embodies as they listen to that student speak to them. And having that understanding, having that appreciation will be in a better position, not just to educate that student, but then for the student to receive that education in a way that affirms the dignity of that student.
I think that really resonates with me personally, because in working with our scholars, I frequently have a discussion where they will tell me, oh, I need to learn how to speak better, or I'm going to this four-year institution to learn how to speak. And I'm always like, wait, no, you communicate just fine. You're going to learn another way of communicating so that you can enter and access more spaces. So I think one of the things I really appreciate about this conversation is also, hey, people showed up here and had to figure things out. And that leads me to my next question. So what examples can you provide to help us understand the link between African-American English and the languages of West Africa?
Yes. So what the research is showing us, and there's been, decades worth of research going back to the 1920s and 30s even, what the research is showing us is that there are a number of different factors that we should be taking into consideration when appreciating this linkage. First of all, the thing that we have to acknowledge up front is the need for us to center this conversation in an appreciation for the illogics of white supremacy. And what do I mean by that? As I indicated in the presentation, by illogics of white supremacy as a system of oppression necessitates that there is no such thing as Black achievement. There is no such thing as Black excellence. There is no such thing as the capacity for Black people to do for themselves, by themselves, with themselves, if you will. And so when you appreciate that, then we can enter into the appropriate arena to have the kind of conversation that enables all of us to walk away with a better understanding. That said, and that taken as a given, there are a few examples that I can provide.
Please, yes.
So, when we're talking about whether a student is using or pronouncing words that lack an R sound at the end, whether or not they are conjugating their verbs, for example, the usage of double negatives, and the additional tenses, such as I'm finna to go, as opposed to I'm going. All of these aspects of speech and language are found in West African languages. That is to say that in certain West African languages, the verb to be does not exist. The usage of double negatives as a means to emphasize a point. And those of us who grew up in Black households know when mama speaks, there's a certain way she speaks to us with the intention to emphasize that she means us to go ahead and get about something. All of these things are cultural, and they're cultural through the pathway of speech. No different than any other community of people on the planet. The only distinction is that with respect to Black folks in this country, with respect to African Americans, our speech journey occurs via or comes from the origin of our speech. West Africa comes through a slave ship. As a consequence of that slave ship, again, going back to this is why it's appropriate and necessary to center this conversation in an understanding of white supremacy. There were no, as I said in the presentation, there were no ESL classes on the plantation.
That's
true.
And
so when we appreciate that, we can better appreciate why it is. If we can appreciate, let me say it like this, if we can understand and appreciate that it's not bad English, it's not broken English. Fact of the matter is it's not English at all. That what you are hearing is the usage of English vocabulary encased in a West African syntax, a West African language system whose concept of time, whose concept of community, whose concept of ability to communicate was vastly different than anything found coming out of Europe. And yet we can find relationships to what we see coming out of many Asian languages, particularly South Asian languages. And so for those that really want to dive deep into this, there's great scholarship coming out of this generation of West African scholars, as well as African-American scholars that are making that linkage, even as they are investigating their own communities' development, post-colonialism and post-slavery and post-Jim Crow. One person I would really highlight is a professor by the name of Michael Takafor and Ndamu, who teaches at the University of Southern Indiana. His work is leading the way in really establishing the language linkages that occur between present day West African languages and what is understood as African American English.
I cannot express to you how much I found this journey that you're taking us on has meant to me personally. You know, my father, who's passed away, he's at the ancestors, but he came to this country from Nigeria and Ghana, and my mother is African American Black. And so I didn't grow up learning Yoruba, but I've heard it spoken. And so hearing you unpack this, it makes me feel closer to both my parents in that way, and seeing how, you know, people find themselves. And so I think that one piece I really, really want you to kind of unpack for us really is like, what do you think the impact to the self-confidence, self-concept of Black students would be if they had access to this, the origins of their primary language? That, like, what do you think that would do for them?
Yeah. You know, as someone who, as a child, had to overcome a speech impediment, I know very well the way my communication as a kid impacted my self-concept. On top of that, you know, that's an issue that any kid has to wrestle with, you know, stuttering, etc. Add on top of that, you know, walking into the classroom and having your teacher look at you funny or use you as an example of not speaking correctly, when all you're doing again is speaking your mother tongue. Were teachers, were families, were communities, were this nation to finally recognize and acknowledge this journey of language of African American people, to know that my language is centered in a history of not just, you know, a history of slavery and servitude, not at all, but a history of folks who chartered kingdoms, nations, developed all types of science and mathematics. For a child walking into school, your self-concept is as strong as any other child walking into that school. And those of us who do this work, those of us who are passionate about teaching, very much appreciate the very real dynamics of oppression and how they invade our psyche and do damage to us even before we hear somebody call us out our name. And so the self-conception of Black children, were they to live in a nation that acknowledged the genesis of their language as that, a language, would do wonders to their ability to walk with a level of confidence that we have not witnessed yet in the world.
I appreciate that so much. And as I think about this, you know, the scholars that we work with are community college students, typically non-traditional pathway to higher education. And to your point in thinking about how walking into an educational institution, whether that be your primary school or secondary school, and having people question your validity in that sense, which I know I've experienced throughout my time in all of the institutions I also think about how that also translates into the working world, right? You know, we've heard stories about people that they have to change their name on their resume, right? To even get the interview, and notice that the no calls goes to I get all the calls. And so I'm also thinking, I wonder if you'd be able to explore what are some ways you think that this impacts organizations who are seeking, I'm not going to name any names, but we've had some media about we can't find any Black people with talent, and that makes me rage a little inside, but I'm thinking like, how do you think that this initial rejection of like having this genius in language, how did you think that permeates throughout society and the long-term impacts of that?
No, thank you. It all goes back to bias, right? And as we know, bias is about perception, not about fact. It's not about reality. It's about the false notions that we carry in our head that are rooted and tied to systems of oppression. That's the reason why, many of us who have internalized systems of oppression carry bias against folk who look like us, whether we are, African American, whether we are women, whether we are disabled, etc. We are constantly bombarded with messages that seek to keep us chained to this legacy of oppression and reality of oppression. Why? Because there are persons that benefit. There are whole communities that benefit from those forms of oppression. And so that person that said those things, no different than another person recently who said some things about, folks not wanting to succeed because they don't want to achieve, speak to this dynamic that we are presently living through. And ultimately, as we know, the solution to any of these problems is organization. And that is something that all of us can be involved in. It's not about who you are. It is really about where you stand on these principled issues of our time. And that work is a work that all of us can be involved in.
Agreed. So just while you were speaking, it made me think, you do a lot of like spoken word and poetry. I know your poetry really helped me kind of access some of this. How do you see the importance of culture and kind of the artistic exchange, how it's kind of like, oh, you're cool if you're talking like this, but you can somehow be both accessible and cool, but yet somewhat unprofessional and not worthy of investment? I'm like, how do you, it's a kind of a weird question, which is kind of like, how do those two things coexist in society?
Well, I think we see that very well with respect to popular culture, for example, right? So, and probably this may have been, some of the fears of this nation's founding fathers, as they say, when they thought about, what would happen were Black folks to finally be free, the impact that Black folks would have on the nation. We see that very clearly in our society. And so, what I know as a poet, what I know as an artist, is that the vitality of the language is at the center of all cultural expression, and that the rules of language are constantly changing. It's not just about, acquiring words from other communities' speech, but it is about even the internal development, the constant motion of the culture that enables the community to continue to realize itself as it engages the world around it. And so, I'm not sure if I actually answered the question or not, but it sounded pretty good to me. I don't know.
I mean, listen, it's a tough one, because I'm always kind of like, why is it cool when everyone wants to come to the party and dance and talk? But then, you turn around. But I want to, so Nancy, I don't know if you have some thoughts you wanted to add to this before I look for some action items for our viewers from Aware, but please join us in this.
Absolutely. Every time that, as you know, we had Aware speak to our students, and I become a student immediately when I, hear not just his interpretation, right, but also the facts that are brought forward. We do have a comment from Dr. Ramon Vega de Jesus, and he notes, and I do encourage other people to ask questions or make comments. We'll make sure we share them here and beyond. But that, as Aware pointed out, and he refers to the Caribbean, which is as a response of resistance to assimilation, and more importantly, as a way of maintaining a bridge to the language and culture of origin. And so I think that is so important. So Aware, I don't know if you want to expand on that and how language is certainly a way to resist assimilation.
please. Yes.
No, thank you for that. I would say that, and pointing us to the Caribbean in particular is probably the best way to have this conversation, because there we're talking about a community of people whose language influence is coming from a variety of different places. We're talking about indigenous, we're talking about African, we're talking about Spanish, we're talking about Portuguese with respect to Brazil, we're talking about French with respect to Haiti. And yet, if one were to approach that conversation in those spaces similarly, one will find the same type of distinction that is present among particularly those African-based communities, whether we're talking about Puerto Rico, whether we're talking about the Dominican, wherever you find African folks, you're going to find a language system that is unique with respect to the vocabulary that you're hearing them articulate. That is to say that, the way Afro-Puerto Ricans speak Spanish is going to be different than what you hear in Spain, right? It's going to be different in the Dominican. It's going to be different in Haiti than what you hear in France. And that has everything to do with both the African presence as well as the indigenous presence. And I'm certain that there are scholars doing tremendous work on those questions as well. And as educators, I'm speaking to educators when I say this, it is your duty to know that scholarship, to take that scholarship on if you are engaged with students who come from those communities. You do yourself a disservice when you fail to do that work. And you will find that those that do that work get a lot further along in advancing whatever education they are attempting to advance in the classroom.
I just want to make one point, and then I'm going to switch it back to Rhoda. But one of the things, and you mentioned it, I am Puerto Rican, I'm an Afro-Latina ESL learner. My first language was Spanish, but like any other language that was brought in through colonization, there's a point that says that, that it came at the end of a sword. And so it was really delivered to you at the end of a sword. And I have learning both Spanish, and then here when we came learning English, and also understanding that English was brought to Puerto Rico, through invasion. And so not invasion of 300 years, but yesterday, right? And so I think all of these things are important, but as a learner of those languages, I think that, to your point, any educator who appreciated that the way that I pronounce things had value, in that it was my way of retaining my culture and retaining my mother's and my father's language, as well as my ancestors, that it did not lower the standard, that there was still a standard. And that concept of what you brought in is that there is a standard. Let it be known that there is a standard. It may not be the standard of the European language, but it remains there. I just can't thank you enough for that. And I know Rhoda is certainly all about the action and what are we going to do next.
Well, we have a little bit more time. So I just had a comment come in. I wanted to share, from Sister Joy Alford, while poetry varies from one culture to another, the power of word remains constant. How can we best engage our youth in the language of poetry?
Certainly, the first thing that comes to mind is no, we have to share the poetry. We have to share the poetry. I would dare say this is true of many, if not all, the cultures. But if one were to look at a community's poetry, one would probably see the clearest evidence of this language transmission and development. I'm thinking now, as we're talking about, say, the writings of Phyllis Wheatley, the writings of George Hammond. Both were enslaved, but in their writing, you hear in Wheatley this effort at claiming what they would call the King's English, right? But with respect to Hammond, there was a clear, consistent effort to speak in his native tongue. And so you have these two tracks that we both hold up in honor through the work of County Cullen, Langston Hughes, moving into the Black Arts movement with Sonia Sanchez, where there was a clear effort to the point that the other person shared about resistance, language as a form of resistance, where the reclaiming of Blackness as a cultural identity was seen as a means to defend oneself, if you will, against the assault of white supremacy, even following the work of the civil rights movement. We're talking now in the late 60s. And so moving into the development of hip hop culture, right? Out of the Bronx and parts of New York, spanning now all over the globe, where you have artists in Cuba, you have artists in Palestine, you have artists in Japan, you have these artists who are speaking truth to power from their own context, centered and rooted in the local language of their communities, because their interest is in not just speaking to those in power, but in affirming the lived reality of the persons who share that reality with them, their fellows in the community. And so, yes, you know, I would say that you look to the poetry and you will find the clearest, most alive evidence of this transmission and development of a people's language.
That is powerful. And I would say, I remembered I did my 5th grade report on Phyllis Wheatley. So I was like, yeah, Phyllis. But right, I was like, yes, Phyllis, I'm on the right track. But I think, because I know we have you booked for so long, and we're so lucky to have you, and we'll have you next week again on Wednesday at 3. But for everyone who's watching, and for those who will see this recorded, I always love to leave people with things to do. So if we were going to give like 1 to 3 action items for people who are interested in this topic, what would you suggest that they could do to move this forward in their lives?
Well, I think that, you know, we're going to be leaving every lesson with a set of books that folk can look to continue their learning, right? We're dealing with topics that are entire classrooms unto themselves, you know. That is to say that this is merely an effort to whet folks' appetite. We're just trying to get you interested in having a kind of conversation that likely you probably have not ever had before. And so that last slide there, or the second to the last slide there were a number of books. I'll just read a couple of them now. Spoken Soul, The Story of Black English by John Russell Rickford, one of the 4 formative scholars in this work. There's The African Heritage of American English by Joseph E. Holloway and Winifred Voss. That particular book not only deals with this question of how African American English came to be, but also looks at another aspect of this conversation, which is the African influence on English, on the English language itself. There's a whole treasure trove of things. There are words that, you know, folk take for granted, think, you know, English, and they're actually, from West Africa. There's a number of other books, but, you know, primarily I would say for those that are interested in doing more, you know, what you can begin doing is if you are African American yourself, you know, begin to listen to yourself. Begin to listen to yourself from a place of honor, understanding that what you are saying and the way in which you are saying it comes from a long legacy of folks who carried over their culture in their bodies, right? Right. I always say this, and when I do this work, there were no suitcases on the slave ships.
No, sir.
So the culture, the retention of culture under the most vile and violent of means is a testament unto itself, a testament not just to the courage, but the tenacity and capacity of African people. That legacy is heard every time Black people open up our mouths and speak freely to ourselves, to each other, and to this world. And for those who are not Black, I would say, you know, listen with new ears. Train yourself. do the work, slow yourself down from making assumptions and allowing the bias of the education that you've received, both in the school and at the dinner table, with respect to Black folks. Hold your tongue and open your ears and listen anew. And what you will find is a treasure of speech and culture that is a gift for all of us if we're only willing to receive it.
I think we're gonna leave it there. You gotta hold your tongue, open your ears, and listen for something new. I see that message, sir, and I just would encourage everyone at home. Thank you, everyone who joined us. Just reconsider the narrative, folks, and we look forward to you joining us next time. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
To really share, everything you have shared, listen with new ears. I take that with me. I also want to thank Rhoda for bringing her full self to her work and to this series, and to our producer Dan Stratford for really putting all the effort that he has done. But most importantly, I want to thank everyone that is listening with new ears and that will continue to join us. This is our first season, and it will be of six different Wednesday meetings. I'm going to call them meetings. And the next lesson will be Outlaw Education, Black Education as Resistance to Slavery. We can't wait to have you join us next Wednesday at 3 p.m. Eware will be there teaching us. And the conversation continues. Please share this widely. The whole point is to get everyone really listen and really take in this information. Most of all, I want to thank everyone that supports the Kaplan Educational Foundation. This is really an effort of everyone that works for the Kaplan Educational Foundation in a way for us to share what we know as well as our resources. It is part of our mission. Education must be driven by a search for diversity and a commitment to it. And so thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next Wednesday. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.